Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ambassador Jack Matlock. Ambassador Matlock served 3 tours at the American Embassy in the Soviet Union before taking up his present position as George F. Kennan Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Ambassador Matlock was the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. Ambassador Matlock, welcome to Berkeley.
Delighted to be here.
When did you first get interested in the Soviet Union and Russia?
Well, I got seriously interested as an undergraduate when I was at Duke University, though obviously Russia had attracted my interest before. I think the most compelling early experience was reading Dostoevsky, obviously in translation because I didn't know Russian as a freshman, but I was rather bowled over by Dostoevsky, and I began to get interested in Russian literature, first of all. By the time Duke began to offer Russian language instruction, which was my junior year.
And that would have been what year?
That was 1948. I immediately signed up for it and took all the courses there relating to Russia, Russian literature, Russian history, etc. And then when I graduated from Duke in 1950, I decided to specialize in Russian affairs and went to the Russian Institute at Columbia, where I did area studies, that is, most of the major disciplines, but along with a major in language and literature.
Do you think it's important that in this education you actually studied the culture, the literature, and the language, even though you wound up doing your work in diplomacy?
Absolutely. I think that was, you might say, my ace in the hole as a diplomat in dealing with that culture, because since I was a specialist in Russian literature, I easily developed a rapport with writers and intellectuals. We shared interests at a time when contacts were very difficult to make. And at the same time, I found that the political side of it, the international relations, which I had studied, though I hadn't majored in it, that you pick up just with the profession. That's sort of on-the-job training, in effect. But the knowledge of foreign cultures are something that takes time, and it particularly takes an interest. So I already was fluent in the language and knew the literature fairly well as you know, a graduate student would, before I ever went to the Soviet Union the first time. And that meant that from then on, I had that interest, and and it certainly increased my rapport with the culture.
In your book, which is being critically acclaimed, Autopsy on an Empire, the American Ambassador's Account of the Collapse of the Soviet Union, you emphasize again and again this rapport with the Russian people as opposed to the government. And so this training must have really helped in that regard.
Well, I think it did. And of course, ultimately, when the Soviet Union began to open up in the late 80s, and my wife and I had a lot of access to television and to large public meetings. This was the thing that fascinated them most. Here was this American, in fact, the senior American representative, who knew their language almost as well as they did, who knew their literature probably better than most did. And somehow, I think that this subliminally cast a very useful image. After all, the propaganda had been that the United States was hostile, that the United States was a bourgeois, relatively uncultured society. And here, their representative, as I'd said, is obviously very, comfortable with Russians, in Russia, takes an interest, and I think this turned out to be extremely useful to our diplomacy there.
And I sense in your book that from this background, you also got a sensitivity to the other nationalities, which was rare both in the Soviet Union and in diplomatic circles in the United States.
Yes, I couldn't develop a full specialty in each of them, but from my experiences even as an undergraduate, I learned something actually from my Russian instructor who wrote his dissertation on the Kazakhs, and I helped him proofread it as as one of his students. Before it went in final, and I began to learn something about their tragic history. I learned to read Ukrainian and got fascinated also by languages like Georgian and the Baltic languages, so that I got a smattering of them to the point that when I went out later and made public speeches, I actually, with a lot of preparation, could make speeches a part of speeches in many of these languages, and this had a tremendous impact. Even if what you said was totally anodyne, just the fact you took the trouble when you came to Tbilisi to do the speech in Georgian, say, or in Armenian if it was in Yerevan, or even a few paragraphs of Kazakh in Almaty. But it conveyed again to the other people that we knew they were different from the Russians, and we respected their traditions. And this was something I think that many of them feared. Particularly true in the Baltic states. They feared being submerged by the rest of the country in the mass of, as sort of Russians or variant Russians, and losing their cultural identity.
Why did you go into the Foreign Service? You served there for 30 years. I mean, with this background, one could see you as a student of Russian literature.
Well, actually, I prepared myself to do either. Teaching and research as a scholar of literature and Russian culture, or Foreign Service. I had them both in mind as a graduate student, and I wanted to be able to do either. After all, I couldn't be sure diplomacy would suit me, and I wanted a fallback profession. But at the same time, at the time I studied, even as a graduate student, Stalin died about the time I got my first job, when I had already qualified my orals for the PhD. And at that time, there was no tourism, there were no students there were no scholars, and I thought, well, you know, if I ever have a chance to live in this country, whose culture I've studied and whose culture fascinates me, I'm going to have to go be a diplomat, or perhaps a journalist. But even the journalist was a very long shot. There may have been 6 full-time American journalists in Moscow, and there were several score American diplomats. So I said, well, you know, I'll be better off being able to reside there as a diplomat than as a journalist. So that was a major motivation. Another motivation was that I was convinced I was of the generation that started college just at the end of World War II in 1946, finished my undergraduate degree in 1950, and I was convinced that the great problem of American diplomacy was going to be dealing with the Soviet Union, and I wanted to be part of that. In fact, when I entered the Foreign Service, I shocked a lot of people by what seemed to be overweening ambition. When I stated frankly, I was asked, oh, you know, what do you want out of the Foreign Service? I said, I want to be American ambassador to the Soviet Union.
So that's great. You got what you wanted.
Yes, yes. Of course, that seemed at the time a very long shot indeed, because we had many more specialists in Russia than could possibly aspire to that post. But it did work out, so I was very lucky in that respect.
And now you've come back to the Academy in a sense, and I have to note, I already noted that you're now the George F. Kennan Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, and I guess a way to talk about what happened on your watch is to talk a moment about George Kennan and that famous X article. Did the namesake of the chair that you hold call it right in that X article? Now
Absolutely, absolutely. I've not agreed with all of the positions he has taken since then, although he's a very good friend of mine and we all respect him greatly. But in that X article, I think this was one of the most brilliant pieces
and we should
of
say
diplomatic reportage. It was not just the X article, it was his long telegram was the official communication which preceded it. The X article was then doctored for the public. I mean, it was the same arguments,
and this appeared in Foreign Affairs, we should say.
It appeared in Foreign Affairs,
48, right.
That's right. But that, his long telegram, which was sent and on which the X article was based, was really the key document which set U.S. policy. He convinced the policymakers for a policy which, broadly speaking, was our policy until the end of the Cold War, and it proceeded precisely as he predicted. Now, at the time, I think George thought that things would happen a little faster than they did, but the fact is, what he recommended was that we keep pressure on the Soviet Union so that they could not, by expansion, seem to justify an irrational system, and thereby force them to confront the contradictions of that system. And that's exactly what happened. And he predicted if they were forced to confront the contradictions, the system would in effect collapse or moderate itself of its own accord. This happened. Now, I think it happened a couple of of decades after he had hoped it would. But that doesn't really matter. The time scales are, in this sort of thing, not important. The fact is, containment was our policy. It was successfully carried out, even when we were sometimes using methods that Kennan didn't approve of subsequently. And the Soviet Union, I think, did collapse eventually, and certainly communist control of the Soviet Union collapsed as a result of having to confront these inner inconsistencies.
Before you became ambassador to the Soviet Union, you served as special assistant to President Reagan from 87 to 91. Was the Reagan policy consistent with the ideas laid down by George Kennan in the containment article?
Actually, I was, first of all, yes, but the dates were a little bit different.
Okay.
I was special assistant from 83 to the end of 86.
And you were actually
I went to
ambassador.
Moscow, yes,
Yeah,
from
sorry.
87 to 91.
Right.
So I was there as we were forming the policy that later I had the pleasure of carrying out as ambassador. I think they were totally consistent because the job I was given when I was brought on the National Security Council staff in the spring of 1983 was to develop a negotiating strategy for the Soviet Union that would end the Cold War, that at least would end the arms race. We couldn't end the Cold War in and of ourselves. We could end the arms race, and we hoped to end the Cold War. And that was in Reagan's mind, I think, from the very beginning. The people who say he changed course midway, I think, didn't understand him and didn't really pay attention to the way he had formulated his policies. He had had very harsh things to say about the Soviet Union, all of which, in my opinion, were true. And yet they may have seemed undiplomatic, but they had a purpose. One was to delegitimize the system. The second, he felt he had to build up, you might say in poker terms, have more chips on the table to negotiate effectively. Thus his arms built up. But at the same time, he always intended to negotiate, and to negotiate the best deals he could. After 2 years of the defense build-up, they decided it's time to negotiate. And I was brought in as a specialist to tell them how to do it.
And in a way, could you make the argument that because Reagan appeared to be extreme in his rhetoric, that he was building a political base to get the treaties approved once there was successful negotiation?
Well, this was in effect. I'm not sure how conscious it was, but it was clear to me. I came on as a professional. I was not a Reaganaut from the beginning. As a matter of fact, though I wouldn't have talked about it then, as a professional Foreign Service officer, I voted for Carter in that election in 1980. But I was brought on the staff as sort of a non-political specialist and treated very well. I was never asked my party affiliation. I must say it was a... But the fact remains that I think that he was looking, for guidance along these lines. And what was clear to us, trying to develop it, was that if we developed a successful strategy and he signed an agreement, the Senate was going to ratify it. He could not be outflanked from the right, and that was a tremendous strength. Now, if Carter had been president at that time, we couldn't have done that. They would have chewed him up, if he had made some of the concessions that we later made, or if he had put forward such a forward-looking program for the Soviet Union as Reagan did in 1984 and 85. As we started negotiations, it would have been chewed up from the right. But he was immune to effective opposition on the right. And of course, when he started doing what the Democrats and the others wanted him to do, and for a time accused him of not doing, they had also no alternative but to support it. So we ended up with a policy with overwhelming public and congressional support. And now, I don't know how much of this was conscious on his part. He was not a disingenuous person. I mean, he was always very frank about his opinions, and I think what he said he really believed in. And there wasn't anything Machiavellian behind it, but it did have that effect.
On your watch, when you became ambassador and served as ambassador from 87 to 91, 3 major things happened. The Cold War ended, communism was defeated, and communism was no longer the operative philosophy in Russia, and then the Soviet Union broke apart and collapsed. Was it inevitable that all three of those things happened?
I don't think so. They were interconnected, but I think you're quite right in separating the three. A lot of people don't. They look at the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union as somehow synonymous. They're not. And actually the U.S. attitude differed greatly in regard to those three events, and our contribution to them differed greatly. We wanted to end the Cold War. And we set terms that were not contrary to Soviet interests, if the Soviet Union was willing to live in peace with its neighbors and not threaten them. And we were careful about that. And a lot of people didn't understand, I think, when they analyzed our proposals. But our proposals were not contrary to the true national interests of the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, we did write sort of the score for the end of the Cold War. And it's to Gorbachev's credit that he saw that it was in their interest to engage us and come to these agreements. So we definitely aimed to and helped end the Cold War. Now, the end of communist rule in the Soviet Union was something else again. We knew we couldn't end that, and if we tried directly, we would probably strengthen it. But we did think that it would certainly, the traditional type of rule would be very much weakened if they opened up, if they became more democratic. And two of the four parts in our agenda had to do with the internal situation. One was protection of human rights, which, by the way, Reagan felt very strongly about. He didn't talk about it as much as Carter, but in a practical sense, he did a lot more for it. He really cared about the individuals that were caught. And he believed that that's something, though we have to make clear what our policy is, had to be pursued mainly by private diplomacy and not a lot of, of rhetoric. And he was very diligent in pushing on human rights, as was George Shultz. And then to open up the Soviet Union, we first talked about improving the relationships by better contact, but what we really meant was breaking down the Iron Curtain. And increasingly we talked about that. Now, these movements, when they began to take place, of course, weakened communist rule. And in order to end the Cold War, Gorbachev himself, I think inspired by Alexander Yakovlev, whom you have interviewed here, actually revised the fundamentals of Marxism to make this possible. And by removing the class struggle as you might say the rock bottom of their international policy, they replaced that with a policy based on, quote, the common interests of mankind, unquote. This is a profound difference, but this also undermined the ideology for communist rule. So they brought about the end of communist rule. We were happy to see it happen, I must confess, but we didn't bring that about. They did. Finally, the end of the Soviet Union. Though we wanted the Baltic states to be given their freedom, we never recognized they were officially part of the Soviet Union or legally part. Nevertheless, we would have been very happy to live with a voluntary federation of the other 12 republics. And President Bush, this gets after the Reagan administration, made that clear in his speech in Kiev in August '91, which Bill Safire has called his Chicken Kiev speech. But if you go back and read it and forget the labels, what he said to the people in Ukraine is that independence and freedom are not synonymous. What you want is freedom. And I think he was absolutely right, because what we have seen has been that by taking independence, one might argue prematurely, a deal was made to keep too many elements of the old system. That is the political deal, and Ukraine has not liberalized, say, to the degree Russia has, and has even deeper economic problems as because of that. But that's rushing ahead of the story. My point is that we did not bring down the Soviet Union, though some people would like to take credit for it now, and some of the chauvinists in Russia would like to accuse us of it. It just isn't true.
Now, we've actually talked about three sets of ideas: Kennan's, Reagan's, and you mentioned Yakovlev. And what emerges in all three of those is a link between foreign policy and the domestic ideology, which moves us from one to two. And I just want to make sure that we make clear the point that you were just touching on, which was namely that in the case of both Reagan and Yakovlev, who was advising Gorbachev, there was the emergence the U.S. already had, but the Soviets did not, the notion that a foreign policy based on kind of the common interests of humanity and that a national interest that takes account of the other national interests involved.
It's not that you ignore your national interests, you try to interpret them in a way which is consistent with the interests of others.
And was the arms race and the danger of nuclear war the key here, or was it other issues like the environment that led them, you think, to make this leap to see the common interests of man, which then turns on its head their philosophy of the class struggle?
It was a combination of things, but of those things, the arms race was by far the most important, because I think they could see very clearly that though they couldn't measure how much it distorted, that their whole emphasis on the military had so distorted their economy, and in fact their life, that it made reform very difficult, and was becoming such a burden that the Soviet Union was losing out in the technological race and many others, not just to the United States, and not just to Japan, but even to South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, the Asian tigers. They began to see that. And it was clear that something very fundamental was wrong. And what was most obviously wrong was the amount of money and emphasis and effort going into armaments. And very early on, I recall some early discussions, particularly between George Shultz, our Secretary of State, and both Shevardnadze, who also contributed to this. We mentioned Yakovlev. Shevardnadze was very much in this camp, too, of redefining foreign policy.
And he was the foreign minister.
He was the foreign minister. So that he was extremely important in this context. But Shultz would talk both to Shevardnadze and to Gorbachev about the fact that, look at what's happening in the world. We're pouring all this money into arms that we cannot use and will not presumably use, because we can't do it without destroying probably civilization on the world and maybe mankind itself. And look what's happening to the growth rates in Germany, in Japan, in many other countries. We're crazy. And in a philosophical sense, there was very early agreement on this, that the two of us were being fools, and that we really had to find a way to end this crazy arms race.
And would you say this to each other?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I know Shultz actually brought in some graphs and things, and almost like in a graduate seminar of economics, and maybe not even graduate seminar, he would say, let's think about this. Look at the future. Look at what has happened. Look at these trends. And he talked to Ryzhkov, the prime minister, about it, and all of them have said in these memoirs, this was very important. But they were already thinking that. Even before Gorbachev came to power, I recall that Gromyko, in a meeting with Reagan, it must have been in the fall of '84, just before when he was elected for the second term, started out by saying, we're sitting on these piles of weapons which we don't need and cannot use. This is irrational. So I think even some of the hardline Soviets were beginning to draw these conclusions, even before Gorbachev came to power, and in effect, on his watch, he had to do something about it. So yes, people were worried about the environment, particularly after Chernobyl. But this has also related to the whole nuclear question. And these other issues were not unimportant. The whole fact that their economy was not keeping up technologically was very important. They could see that it was running down. The system just wasn't working. But the key element was the amount going into arms.
Let's look at the figures that you were dealing with. What is your assessment of Gorbachev? Looking back now at that time, what did he get right and what did he get wrong?
He got ending the Cold War right, and in so doing, I think he earned his place in history. Second, I think ultimately, though there was a lot of bobbing and weaving and toing and froing, he got right the relative priority between preserving the Communist Party and trying to build a more democratic and open society. And he opted for the latter. And probably history, I think, will eventually give him credit for that. His own countrymen seem to have forgotten it. I say in my book that I think he led his people out of bondage. He was unable to reach the promised land, but maybe there's historic precedent for that. And maybe he won't be blamed too much for it by later historians. I do think he made, when the push came to shove, the right decisions. And without what he did, the power of the Communist Party could not have been fatally undermined. And he did it. And he did it, I think, recognizing not at first, but eventually what he was doing. Right at first, he thought he could strengthen the party and convert it to a progressive thing. I think certainly by the time he established a presidency, he was already set on a course to replace the party with a presidential type system and take them out of total control of the country, which happened very rapidly, I would say, between the middle of 90 and 91. So that by the summer of 91, the Communist Party had virtually lost control of the country. And of course, the coup attempt in August was to restore this, and it failed. And when it failed, the Communist Party was immediately outlawed, and of course, the whole underpinnings of holding the state together, which had held it together, were then cut. This allowed then the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but that happened, I would say, despite Gorbachev, though he had made some mistakes. He didn't move fast enough with his Union Treaty. He didn't move fast enough with economic reforms. To be fair, I don't think anybody really knew what had to be done, and if they had known how painful the transition was going to be, they might have decided that it was politically impossible. In fact, I think things had reached a stage in 90 and 91 that there was no way to bring about a transition that didn't bring much of the misery which has succeeded. So I don't blame the reformers for that. I really blame what happened before. And Gorbachev never really understood fully what had to be done to reform the economy.
And you also, in your book, seem to be suggesting that he had his limits as a democratic politician, so to speak, a small d, in the sense that his sources of information were not what they should be. He relied too much on his KGB advisor. But you do credit him with never using force to maintain his own power.
That's right. And I know people have challenged this by saying, look, force was used in Tbilisi, force was used in Vilnius when 12 people or so died, force was used in Baku and Azerbaijan. Of those three, he clearly authorized force in Azerbaijan, but he had a horrible pogrom going forward. And maybe it was the wrong thing to do, but it was understandable. And it was sort of like bringing in the National Guards at the riots in LA. We use force under situations of that sort, and that was not to keep himself in power. The other two, I think it's clear in Tbilisi that he did not authorize that. That happened. He was out of the country and apparently didn't know about it in advance. In the case of Vilnius, people are still divided on the issue. He says he didn't order it, and I'm inclined to believe him. But even if so, it was for limited purposes. Again, it was not for the purpose of keeping himself in power. And when he could have used it to keep himself in power by preventing Yeltsin and the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus from meeting secretly near Brest, in the meeting in December 91, when they brought down the Soviet Union, he refused. And we do know that some of his advisors, including some of his Democratic advisors, advised him to use force. And at that point, the army would have been reacted reliably to preserve the Soviet Union, what was left of it. By that time, the Baltic states had already been freed. But he flatly refused. He said he was not going to stay in power using those means. So I would maintain that I think it's very clear he refused to use force to keep himself in power. He would authorize it as a last resort if he felt it was necessary to put down a riot or to end violence. That is true, but I think most effective leaders will make those decisions.
You also fault him for not working out arrangements with Yeltsin.
Yes.
He was obsessed with Yeltsin and would not deal with it.
He became obsessed early on, and one of his weaknesses was his inability to work in tandem with charismatic people who might someday gain greater popularity than he did. And so he tended to put down or keep subordinate and sometimes force off his team some of his most talented people. So he ended up with second-raters and even third-raters who furthermore were treacherous and betrayed him. And that, of course, in a leader is a very, very serious fault, in my opinion. I think he could have kept Yeltsin on the team a lot longer. Undoubtedly, at some point, Yeltsin, given the chance, would have tried to challenge him. But the best way to head that off would be to use him at least as long as you could and to keep him on the team. Instead, he opted fairly early on in the game to force him out. And then this year left Yeltsin with no option, if he was to get political power, than taking Gorbachev on. And eventually, I think his motivation in ending the Soviet Union in order to remove Gorbachev from office became overpowering for Yeltsin. So I think there was a serious mishandling of the whole Yeltsin phenomenon. But it was a part of a deeper fault on his part, the inability to work in tandem with very talented people. I mean, after all, when you look at our politics, you find sometimes very different people, a president working with a vice president. We've had that situation now, a very talented one who is certainly able to challenge the other for it, but and you certainly found that situation, say, with Reagan and Bush, very different people, but they understood that in order to win and so on, you work in tandem, and eventually maybe the other one can succeed, the one who is subordinate for a while. Gorbachev never learned that, and I think that was one of his failings.
Can I ask you to put on your George F. Kennan professor hat and look back at U.S. policy, especially during this period where you were playing such an important role? Is there anything we got wrong, or did we pretty much get everything right?
I think basically we got things right. Now, one can argue that we didn't need as much a defense buildup as we did, that we put too much emphasis on SDI.
That's the Star Wars.
What popularly was called Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative. And, I don't think you can prove one way or the other. I would only say, if you're working with a policy which, if it goes wrong, can not only destroy your country or the world, you tend to overinsure. And I think what we were trying to do ultimately worked. Maybe something different would have also, but that's an if. If you take the SDI itself, the Star Wars, without that, I'm not sure the Soviets would have moved as rapidly as they did to agree to reduce their heavy missiles. These are the ones we considered most threatening. And without that, we could not have had a strategic arms agreement. Their negotiators now say, well, yeah, it may have been a scam, and for some American officials it was a scam in the sense that we were trying to give them incentive to reduce their heavy missiles. Most people who were close to it knew that this was far off in the future and would probably never provide a totally impenetrable shield. And yet, if we could develop a defense that would protect us from a lot of the heavy missiles, we didn't have to worry about, even theoretically, about a first strike from the Soviet Union. And that was the big danger of the heavy missiles. Now, in retrospect, a lot of people may say, oh, this was theology that was not very relevant. But I don't think so. I think that any responsible president, responsible for the future of this country and its safety, had to take these things seriously. And maybe we put more in than we needed to, but I'd say if we did, I would much rather pay a little higher insurance premium than cut things so close that you may fail, because the failure in this would have been, well, incredibly costly, particularly if it resulted in a war. And another thing that a lot of people forget is that right up until 1986, the Soviet High Command thought they could prevail in a nuclear war. This tends to be forgotten. They thought they could prevail, and Yazov, their last defense minister, in effect, or the defense minister during most of Gorbachev's period, has said privately many times that until Chernobyl disaster, he thought they could prevail in a nuclear war. He said after that it was clear you couldn't, and we had to get rid of these damn weapons. But, so it was that accident that convinced him. As he said, you don't even have to use nuclear weapons to have nuclear destruction. Conventional weapons on nuclear power stations can paralyze a country. And therefore, that war is unthinkable between countries that have these things. And we had a totally different psychology after that. But up until then, we were dealing with the psychology on the military, not necessarily the political leadership, but the military, which is highly influential, that if nuclear war came, they could win it. And that, I submit, is a very dangerous scenario. And there, I'm thankful that we, I would say, that we tended to pay for more insurance rather than trying to save and perhaps have an inadequate policy.
What you're saying, as we discuss these issues, is a number of things really came together to end the Cold War. The the Reagan policies, the Chernobyl disaster, the changing in the attitude of the Russian military, and then a set of ideas among Gorbachev's advisors about, which led to this new definition of the common interests of man.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right. Let's look ahead now. The Soviet Union is going through an extended transition. What would you like to see in a U.S. policy that would be effective now that the Cold War is over in our dealings with Russia?
Well, I would like to see, first of all, a major effort to bring Russia into the European security system, an effective European security system. In that sense, I think the challenge, though the circumstances are quite different, we didn't defeat the Soviet Union in a war the way we defeated Germany and Japan in World War II. We don't occupy the country and therefore have a fairly free hand in how we can restructure it, or at least start restructuring, as we did in Germany and Japan. But nevertheless, we did win the Cold War, and we won it on our terms acceptable to us. And Russia is feeling very much defeated. Now, and yet, the victory in the Cold War was a joint one. I think that all the talk about we won the Cold War may have been useful politically, though it didn't do George Bush an awful lot of good in his second election, but it may have been useful politically at home, but it was not useful politically internationally, because the way we looked at it at the time and the way Gorbachev looked at it, we all won the Cold War. We ended it. And this was to the benefit of all of our countries. And it unleashed political processes that broke up the Soviet Union, but there are many positive aspects to that. Russia is now free to be itself in a way that it wasn't before. So to treat them as a defeated country, I think, is wrong, psychologically and politically. But there is enough of the analogy with World War II. We did have the foresight, our leaders at that time, to see that if we were going to have a peaceful and strong Western world, we had to bring the defeated into the system, Japan and Germany. And we did, and very effectively, of course. Now, I think the big challenge, particularly for security, is to bring Russia into that. And I don't think we are making very good efforts to do so. In fact, putting an issue like NATO expansion, which is not necessary in security terms, which does not meet the real security requirements of the future, ahead of developing a workable security relationship with Russia, bringing them into the system, I think is putting our priorities absolutely wrong. Now, of course, we say we want to do both, but that's a little like saying we're going to square the circle. In mathematics. It sounds simple, but it turns out to be impossible. I mean, it sounds simple to the uninitiated. So I think in the security sense, we have to bear in mind a very basic fact that unless Russia, which still has over 20,000 nuclear weapons, 50,000 tons of chemical weapons, and we don't know how much in bacteriological weapons. Russia, either we have their cooperation or they're part of it, or they're going to be one tremendous problem. Not from the standpoint they're going to start invading other countries. I don't think they can. They don't have, either the political cohesion nor the military power to do that. But from the standpoint of becoming the source of great instability, particularly if these weapons get out. We need them in the security structure, and we're forgetting that. A second basic point is that properly defined, our national interests are not in conflict. Of course, they're not identical. No two countries have totally identical. But fundamentally, U.S. and Russian interests are not in conflict. And if we act as if they are, or if they act as if they are, we create unnecessary collisions, and we begin to create much of the atmosphere of the past. A third thing we need to remember is Russia is not the Soviet Union writ small. It is a totally different entity in terms of its polity. Many of the people are the same, and yet you put them in a different context and you get a different situation. We are facing a different situation, and to think of them in the stereotypes of the past, as some of our prominent people do. Henry Kissinger is one. I think he's absolutely wrong in his analysis of what's going on in Russia. And his prescriptions would actually help create sort of some of the mistakes of the past. in the future, our problems are going to be, security problems are going to be much more related to terrorism, to the rogue state, and so on, than to the sort of empire-building collision of empires of the past. I'm convinced of that, and if we look at history, we will see that the Cold War was about ideology and about the Soviet system. It wasn't about Russia. Mm-hmm. And when Russia was non-communist, Russia was a friendly country on the whole, sometimes distant, mm-hmm. but we had a relationship beginning at the earliest stages of the American existence. In fact, our first diplomatic representative was John Quincy Adams, who later became one of our presidents. Russia was with the Union during the Civil War at a time when England sympathized with the Confederacy. So on the whole, our relations with Russia has been good. We settled any territorial disputes we had peacefully. They sold us Alaska, and they don't claim it now. We ended up with California instead of them, and though there may be a little nostalgia, they don't claim it. So we have no fundamental conflicts out there. We never fought a war with Russia. I think that tells us something, because there's not another great power in the world except for France that we never had a single war with. Wars are usually about very fundamental national interests.
What about the Weimar analogy? That is, that the wrong kinds of policies on our part could create internal instability in Russia, analogous to what happened in Weimar after World War I?
I don't see the emergence of an effective sort of fascist or right-wing movement. By the way, I don't see much difference between a communist regime and a fascist regime. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think one of the greatest intellectual confusions that many intellectuals have had over these decades is the whole right and left thing. Fascists are on the right, communists are on the left. Nonsense. They come together and overlap, and we're seeing this in Russia today, where the allies are the nationalistic chauvinists and the communists. Mm-hmm. They are natural allies because they are authoritarians by nature, and more than authoritarians, they tend to be totalitarians, which means that they tend to destroy all the elements of a civil society. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's much more important than whether you're philosophically right or left. You know, are you willing to create and live in a civil society, in an open society, or not? That, to me, is the basic issue. And the thing is, I think that the totalitarians, and there are plenty of them there, if they unfortunately should get power, they're going to destroy the country. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can establish a totalitarian dictatorship. Having said that, however, there's no question that if we move in the wrong fashion, we can encourage these tendencies rather than discourage them. Mishandling NATO expansion is one way you encourage chauvinistic tendencies and create greater insecurity, in effect, around Russia's borders. Second, I think setting too high a standard for them to come into international organizations. I think there should be standards, and they should be willing to abide by the rules. You don't stretch the rules for them. But I think the name of the game, if you're going to create or help their democratic forces create a civil society and democratic institutions, you bring them into international organizations under condition that they act responsibly. But if you say that, you know, you're out until you can prove that you're like us, well, they're never going to be exactly like us, mm-hmm. Or we're going to expand NATO regardless of what you think. Now, of course, this is not directed at you, and everybody knows that what is bringing the East Europeans in is their fear of Russia. I mean, you can't have it both ways. But the impact on Russia is that we're not threatening these countries. Why are they cutting us out? Is our security of no value? If it is, why don't they say so? And I don't know why we don't say, look, Russia's security is also important to us. We need to work with Russia to bring them into a European system. Meanwhile, NATO has an important role. Let's try to work out something with Russia. If Russia ever threatens other countries, then we're going to have to consider expanding NATO. But until they do, our priority is bringing them into the world system under terms that they will be responsible. By the way, this would also be a great leverage to keep Russian policy responsible. Because if it looks as if we're going to act regardless of what they think about things regarding their security ultimately, they are going to become, I would say, much more of a loose cannon, looking for alliances with Iran and maybe with China and whatnot. And these are not going to work either. But the fact is they bring about much greater instability and a lot of psychological feelings of hostility when there's no need for it.
Looking back at where we began and looking at your career, what do you think are the key elements in making diplomacy work, and what sort of skills does a diplomat have to have?
Oh, you know, it's hard to enumerate all of them because they are so many. When it comes to guiding your own country about what's happening in the country where you are accredited, there is no substitute for knowing that country's culture, knowing that country's language, although occasionally we have had some outstanding diplomats who haven't had a good knowledge of the language and develop an ability to understand. Without that, that's pretty rare. I mean, it can happen, but it's pretty rare. At the same time, you have to do this while understanding how things work in your own country. You can't forget that. A good diplomat uses diplomacy with his own government as much as he does with other governments. And I think of an effective diplomat as one who is very attuned to political and social and other needs at home in the country he's representing, and then also has a deep knowledge of the country where he is and can mediate. Because you often, it's surprising how often the disputes are really over things that don't need to be disputed. In other words, once one country formulates a given a group of desiderata or policies and the other, and they look at odds, then you begin almost to reify these positions. When you begin to look behind them, you'll find that what we really want is something quite different from what they want, and you can develop a win-win strategy. This gets very hard if the negotiations are totally public and the press and the media are constantly looking at everything as if it's a football game. Who is winning points, who is losing them. Because if you do it that way, you end up usually with a compromise that's unsatisfactory to both, if you can compromise at all. If you look at it the other way, let's analyze on both sides what the interests are. The common interests, getting back to the formula that Yakovlev, Gorbachev, and Shevardnadze came up. I think this has profound importance, and we ignore it sometimes. We ignore it here at home when we get advice, that we don't need the rest of the world, and we don't need the UN, and so on, because you can only be truly effective if you begin to formulate your interests in a way that other countries can see it also in their interests. And there are ways you can do that. Everything doesn't have to be confrontational. But anyway, I think the skill in seeing that and conveying on both sides in a proper way, a diplomat has to be disciplined. When you talk to another government, whether you agree with what your government wants or not, you've got to be faithful to it. After all, they care much less about what you think personally than what your government thinks. And until you convince your government to change the policy, you darn well better represent it, faithfully with the country where you are. But also to keep sufficient lines open that you know when a good time is to get your policy recommendations in. I used to tell my class that if you want to be effective as an advisor, you have to be a good reporter, you have to understand the situation, you have to have all of those things. But most of all, you have to have a sense of timing. I said, just as in real estate, I hear that the three most important factors are location, location, location. In policy recommendations, the three most important factors are timing, timing, timing. Kennan's long telegram that we talked about earlier, if it had been sent 2 years earlier, would not have had any effect. That was the height of the war. Nobody was going to change the policy then. A lot of the evidence he used hadn't accumulated. He sent it at the right time. And besides being sound advice, that's what made it effective. And if the political constellation at home is one in where the political leaders are not prepared to look at alternatives, you only undercut your effectiveness if you're constantly hammering at them to change when you know they're not going to. When you reach a point where something happens to make it necessary to change, that's when you come in. And this takes, of course, this is much more art than science.
One final question. If students want to prepare for a career in global affairs, what would you recommend that they do?
Number one, get as wide a liberal arts background as possible. This is, everything human is important to the diplomat. You're dealing with human beings, you're dealing with cultures. Second, make sure you're comfortable in cultures other than your own. Doesn't mean you have to adopt all of the things, but you've got to understand them. And if you feel like a fish out of water, this is not the profession for you. Expect change, and if you find the unexpected and change stimulating, then you may make a fine diplomat. If you find that it disorients you, these are not moral qualities, they're different types of human beings, and that you really want stability in your life and some predictability, diplomacy is not for you. Because you're going to get a new job every 2-3 years. Usually there are going to be serious things wrong, either with the place or with your boss or something else. And I would say also, I think a very high degree of an optimistic nature. I think that you need to combine a certain realism. You can't get so idealistic that you lose grip on reality. But you, at the same time, you do have to maintain an attitude that what you're doing is important, and that it's not just a matter of routine work, although there may be a lot of routine involved. Finally, for heaven's sakes, don't come in with some idea you're going to change the world. You're not, or that if you have some theory about the way things go and that your job is to convince your government that that theory is right, regardless of what the things are. I think this would make you a disastrous diplomat. Better to be a theoretician and to be read by other specialists if that's your temperament.
Ambassador Matlock, thank you very much for spending this time with us for this fascinating tour of the events that you were involved in and of your life work in diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Glad to be here.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation on international affairs.